I'm James Champion, ultra keen travelling specimen angler and part of the Dynamite Baits team for over 5 years. This is the first in a new series of videos where I'm going to be telling the stories of some of my most memorable captures. Late winter and early spring through February, March and April can be a fantastic time to target a really big roach. The low water temperatures mean that the small fish aren't yet active, meaning you can get away with using things like maggots quite easily without getting a lot of hassle. And also those bigger roach are in prime condition as they build up for spawning. So it really is a fantastic time to get on the bank and try and catch yourself a PB. I've travelled all over the country in pursuit of big fish of different species. And my first adventures after a big roach actually took me north of the border to Scotland. There was a water up there that became really famous over a short period of time for producing incredible captures of huge roach, and that was Loch Castle down in Stranraer. I was fortunate enough to have a couple of trips there over several seasons and did manage to catch some of these roach for myself, including a new PB of £2 13 ounces. Over the years that followed, I never felt like I really got that close to that £3 barrier, never quite beat my PB, and didn't even really feel like I had a water in mind that was capable of doing so. I did fish a few trips on the famous Willow Lake on the Lynch Hill complex, which is the scene of many a roach angler's PB and has produced some incredible fish over the years. But I just didn't feel like my timing was right. I felt like those fish were long gone by the time I got there, and I just didn't have a better alternative on offer. If you fast forward to 2019, in January, February, there were some incredible captures of roach reported to the Angling Times, including multiple hauls of £3 specimens and some fish not far off £4. What was more, these fish were immaculate, not the kind of condition you expect a roach of that age and that size to be, and they just looked phenomenal creatures, like they'd just been born yesterday but were over £3 in weight, and I just couldn't imagine seeing a fish of that calibre on the bank. Our first task was figuring out where these captures were coming from. I remember brainstorming with a couple of friends at the time, trying to figure out where it could be from. One of my friends had a really good idea that it might be from a big lake in the Cotswold Water Park called groundbait, a huge gravel pit of over 100 acres, which was predominantly a carp water. Now, most interestingly, this particular lake was actually a day ticket venue, meaning you could go to the local tackle shop, buy a ticket there and then, and just get fishing. So if this was indeed the venue that was producing these incredible captures of roach, there was nothing stopping me having a go, apart from just the enthusiasm to go and take on a water of such magnitude. Now, I'd never heard of this lake before this period of time, never fished the water park, never even fished around the area before, but it was only a couple of hours from my home, so it wasn't going to take a lot of effort and planning to go and give it a first go. It was the end of March that I finally knew about this venue, and therefore I didn't have long before the roach would be spawning and my opportunity would have to wait for another year. So I was determined to have at least a couple of trips in early April when my timing could potentially be absolutely perfect to find one of these giants for myself. I remember turning up at the venue in that particular time and having a rough idea where I wanted to be. Another friend of mine had actually fished it the week before, and he'd caught one of these £3 roach for himself, along with one a few ounces under, and he'd given me some inclination of where he'd caught them from. He mentioned there was a large bay on the end of the lake, probably 20 acres in its own right, but he mentioned that he'd caught them from that vicinity of water. And after arriving, I quickly realised that there weren't many swims that gave access to that water at all. In fact, most of the bay was out of bounds to anglers entirely, with the whole of the opposite bank being closed because of a new housing development. And that meant there were only 2 or 3 swims that actually fished the entrance to and the beginning of this bay whatsoever. When I turned up for a couple of nights on my first session, a lot of these swims are already taken, so I dropped in the nearest available swim that was free, just to try and get as close as I could to that large bay area. I remember that first night just having a good lead around, trying to find a couple of areas to fish to, but just wanted to start fishing and getting a feel for the water really, making sure I was up and watching at first light and last light to see if I could watch for any roach priming. Nothing happened on that first evening apart from a little crayfish activity, and the crayfish were rampant in this lake. In fact, I'd heard of several anglers having their bait stripped clean overnight and therefore not fishing properly at all, and therefore I was very conscious that could easily happen to me, and despite fishing in the right areas, not be fishing effectively. Fortunately, that following morning, one of the anglers further up into the bay was packing up, and he was also roach fishing, and he told me that he'd actually managed a couple of big fish that night. So I wasted no time packing all the kit down, throwing it on the barrow and moving as far up to the bay as I could. Actually, the very final swim before the out of bounds area to make sure I was in what seemed to be the hotspot and I could finally put myself in contention with catching a new PB roach. I was in that area for probably late morning, so I had plenty of time that day to sort out the rods and find a couple of good areas to target for the night ahead. From what I could see from other captures, from the photographs, and from what other anglers had mentioned to me, a lot of these roach seemed to be caught at night, so therefore I wasn't too concerned about fishing effectively through the day. I was more enthusiastic to try and take the time, figure out the swim, and fish as effectively as possible through that period of darkness, which is something I do a lot in my fishing. A lot of my time isn't actually spent fishing, it's just spent figuring out the swim and finding the best areas to target, so that when I am fishing, I'm fishing as effectively as I can. I remember having a good lead around and using the deeper to sort of comb the swim and get a better idea of it as quickly as I could. But there wasn't much to fish to really. A lot of it was fairly deep, sort of 10 to 12 feet, but flat and fairly featureless. There wasn't a lot out there apart from a few harder patches, and it was one of these firmer patches that I decided to target with 2 rods on maggot feeders. I was using the now very famous roach setup of a maggot feeder helicopter rig. It's just a deadly rig for big roach, and then if I didn't want to start tweaking things too much on a new water when I had such confidence in that approach before. So it was a simple feeder rig, a 35-gram Drennan feeder bomb, which is a fantastic feeder to use on these big waters, as it really does do a great job of cutting through headwinds and allows you to present baits really accurately, which I was very keen to do. A very short hook link, a 5-pound fluorocarbon fish to a size 16 hook, baited with a couple of maggots, and also a fake grub to help avoid the attentions of the crayfish. By late evening, I had 2 rods in position on a gravel patch, which I'd baited using a spod with a little bit of ground bait and a little bit of hemp seed as well. I didn't want to put too much bait in. I baited very lightly, just enough I was hoping to attract the attentions of the roach to that baited area, and ideally they could home in on the maggot feeders. So I wasn't introducing any maggots other than what I was putting in the feeders, because I didn't want those spread around. I wanted to create little hotspots of bait that hopefully these big roach, if I was lucky enough for them to drift over me at some point, they could home right in on and find my hook bait. The first few hours of the evening passed really quietly. I remember climbing into the sleeping bag, feeling quite cold, but fairly confident that something might happen through the night. I knew that I was in the right area. The rigs were presented perfectly. The spots seemed great, and I just could not do any more. It was in the early hours, probably around 4 or 5 a.m, that I was woken up by a couple of bleeps on what turned out to be the middle rod. I was fishing a 3rd rod off the baited area, just on its own, but these 2 rods were fished on a really tight little patch over that spotted out hemp and ground bait. And it was the left-hand rod. As I peered out of the brolly door, I could see the bobbin just wedged up tight, and sure enough, I'd had a bite. So I threw on my shoes, jumped out the sleeping bag, and bent into what I was hoping was going to be one of these enormous roach. Picking up the rod, just felt a couple of nods on the rod tip. Just felt like it should when you've hooked a big roach. It didn't feel dramatic. It's not taking any line, but just a couple of slow, gentle nods. I start to draw the fish back towards me, feeling really nervous about that size 16 hook holding. I remember vividly having my head torch on, just sort of peering down the margins, watching the line angle, and just hoping that eventually I was going to catch a glimpse of a huge roach sort of twisting and turning down in the marginal shelf. And sure enough, eventually I caught a couple of flashes of silver in the beam of the head torch, and I could see a roach that I was attached to. And it was big, but I didn't appreciate quite how big it was until it rose up through the water column, hit the surface, and I managed to bundle it into the net without too much drama. And suddenly I found myself just sort of peering down with my head torch on, looking at this just bar of silver that was both immaculate and massive as well. It just looked incredible. It reminded me of the size of fish I was catching up at Loch Nor probably 5 or 6 years previously, but this thing looked even bigger than the fish I'd managed up there. Now, I didn't waste too much time getting it on the scales, and it did confirm a truly mammoth roach and a new PB at 3 pounds 2 ounces. I just could not believe that I'd managed to latch into one of these fish so early on, just a couple of nights in to fishing this massive expanse of water. And it just goes to show what you can achieve if you get your timing and location absolutely spot on. It wasn't long before dawn now, and I was keen to get a couple of really good daylight shots, so I retained the fish in a really deep landing net in the margins and got that rod back out. But I couldn't believe it when I had another bite on that same rod just an hour or so later and found myself playing another huge roach. Guiding this fish in, it was almost a carbon copy of the first fish. Even though I had a PB sitting in the landing net already, I still felt so nervous about what I might be attached to, and I was just praying for it not to fall off as I drew it back towards the net. Similar, another massive bar of silver rose up through the margins, and I found myself with suddenly a brace of huge roach sitting side by side in the landing net. It was just a phenomenal morning. I remember bringing these huge fish out and just staring down at this brace of just immaculate huge roach, a brace of 3 pound roach. That other one went 3 pound 3, and it was just sheer elation. I could not believe that not only had I broken my PB, but that I'd caught a brace of 3 pound roach, and it was just one of my most memorable sessions that I'm likely to ever have. It's just a great example of the fact that if you hear about a special water producing some big fish right now and you can get access to them, don't waste any time, because sometimes these opportunities do not last long and you do not want them to pass you by. So if you know about that kind of venue, get out there and try and catch a PB roach right now.